Hello, Spark fans, and happy 2021 to everybody. Let's just ignore what's going on in the world and talk about some tech. So, people thought I was going a little bit soft towards the end of last year. I talked about, how good a year it had been and some news and some white papers, and apparently I should get back to the tech. So we're going to do something down and deep and dirty and techy today by taking a look at some of the trouble you can get into using Autoloader. How you can have multiple event grids spun up, how you can have orphaned things lying around and how you collect them up. And one of the good things is we now have the Scala API to go and clean up anything that's left over by Autoloader. So we'll take a look at it. We'll take a look at what happens when you refresh on Autoloader, when we get lots of event grid stuff going on, and we'll go through how to use the Scala API and go from there. Otherwise, Happy New Year. Welcome back. If it's your first time tuning in, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, if you are a data engineering sort and you're into your Spark and your Microsoft Azure and your data platformy stuff, Advanced Analytics are recruiting currently. So I'll drop a link down below, but feel free to apply if you'd like to come and work with us and do this kind of thing on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, because of Brexit shenanigans, we can only bring on people who have a right to work in the UK currently. Who knows what the future will bring, but that is where we are. Anyway, let's start talking about some tech. Okay, so I've got a blob store here. Do a quick little bit of a recap about Autoloader, the kind of things that we're doing. So I've got a container, got my landing folder, I've got NYC Taxi just as a virtual folder within my blob, and then I've got a couple of CSV files. I've got some data that has been dropped here for me to go and play with. Okay, so that is my source. That is my source data I want to go and have a play with. And then over on the other side, I've got my lake. So I've got ADLS Gen 2, got my lab area, I've got an Autoloader area, and then in here, I've got a checkpoint, and that's very important because Autoloader is a streaming Spark query. That means it needs to know a checkpoint, so it knows which files it's already read. So it can check it against going, I was reading from that queue, I've read up to, no, I've read that file, I've read that, oh, that file's new, I'll bring that through. And that checkpoint's very important. And then the data is just my Delta table. I've got a load of files, I've got my Delta log, all my normal stuff. And I'm trying to link from one into the other via an Autoloader query. So having a quick look at some stuff. This is an example I've been through on the channel before. I'll drop a quick link to the previous video. If you've never seen Autoloader, definitely advise you take a look at that one first. I'm not going to explain what everything does. Some basic stuff. I've got a schema. So Autoloader currently needs a schema for everything. So whether it's CSV, Parquet, whatever it happens to be, I need to give it a structure. So I've got a quick, dirty, hard-coded JSON schema I'm passing through. I've got all my cloud file settings. So because Autoloader is based on event grid, it needs to be able to connect to the blob store, create an event grid topic, create an event grid subscription, set up a blob storage queue, and actually be able to see where we're trying to push data to. So there's lots of different bits of things it needs, and it needs the ability to do that. Databricks itself doesn't have those permissions. And so we're having to do things like give it a shared access signature key for the blob store so it can talk to that queue. We're giving it the service principal data, so it actually has the ability to go and set up that event grid stuff. Now, there are alternatives. We can set that stuff up in advance and just hook into some existing ones if we don't want to give Databricks that power. For now, I'm like, go nuts, do your own thing. So I've got that. That's just a load of calls to my secrets. So it's going into a key vault, pulling back that info, and passing that into a bit of a config file and saying, look, in my cloud file JSON, like my map, my subscription ID, my connection string, my format, a load of stuff that I need to pass in to my cloud files query. I'm telling it how to connect to the blob store because I've not mounted it this time. And I'm saying, okay, so my data frame, spark.readstream, it's a format of cloud files. Now, the files are actually a CSV, and inside my cloud file settings, I'm telling it it's a CSV, but I need this kind of parent type of cloud files to tell it that it's an Autoloader job. So cloud files, looks in there, gets the lower level detail, and you can still pass in other options. So because I'm reading from CSV, if I wanted things like a bad records path and a headers and infer schema and some of those things, schema, not too much because I pass it schema, but some of the traditional options you can push into the different data readers, you can also pass those. It's not just the cloud file ones. Okay, I'm giving it schema. I'm giving it the load location. So I'm telling it this is where to go and find that blob. And that's fairly straightforward. So let's just actually run down those as I go. It's going to go through, it's going to run all these things, going to go and create my data frame. And then because I've got a schema, it'll tell me my data frame fairly quickly once it's attached to the cluster. At that point, it's not actually going off and reading those files. It's just saying, sure, I can pretend the schema you've given me makes any kind of sense. And then when that's loaded, we're going to go into this thing. So I'm creating a stream query object. Now, I don't have to. I could just do straight dataframe.writeStream and run that. But if I want to be able to interrogate what happened in that streaming job, I can create a variable called stream query, assign that write action to my my variable, and then I can go and do things like recent progress and kind of just start querying what happened inside that stream. Okay, so those have all run. I can see I've got my data frame. It's gone off. It's imported, so I can run this. Now, we saw in my lake, I already had a checkpoint. So I've already run this autoloader job previously. So this is going to go look in that checkpoint, say, well, which EventGrid subscription are you using? Which queue should I be looking at? It kind of has all that metadata built in. So if I go and run this, refresh, I get a few bits of useful info. So the first thing to note is I get this ID. Now that is a unique identifier for the streaming query that goes into that checkpoint file. And you might think, well, no, does it matter? Does anyone care? But just let's remember that. So C269CO blah, 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 blah. So C269 and then some stuff, that we're going to see that ID in a few different places. So firstly, let's just take that and then go back into our root folder, and we can have a look in our checkpoint. We've got a load of different things, we've got offsets, our metadata. And if we look at our metadata file, inside, we have an ID. Oh, look, C269CO13. So the query that I'm running in Databricks is intrinsically linked to the metadata checkpoint folder. Makes sense. That's the whole point. But it means we can actually sort of, if you're looking at a delta table and you're like, what's the ID of this streaming query? You can find it from within that checkpoint, which is good. That's useful piece of info number one. Now, if we switch over back to our landing area and we go and have a look, there's a few different bits and pieces that Autoloader will have created for us automatically. So first things first, we've got the events. So I've got the event subscription. I can see there's a few different event subscriptions built up. And I can see, so again, should be fairly familiar down at the bottom, Databricks query C269CO13. It's created a event subscription specifically for the query that I'm running. So I've got a general topic, which is for this blob store, but then I've got an individual query, which is a subscription to that event trigger. And it's got some stuff in there, and it's got a prefix filter. So I can say, well, what are you looking for? And I can see that this is specifically one that's looking for NYC taxi. And I've got a couple that are doing the same thing. Now, one of the things that I've had to do quite a lot of times pragmatically working around going, oh, do we need to load that data again? Oh no, we missed a file, or I've re-uploaded the same file. Now, Autoloader, it won't trigger on appends to a given file. It's only when it gets a new file. So if I wanted to restate an existing file that's already read, Autoloader won't load it. You know, I'd have to delete it, reload it, will that trigger it properly, or when it thinks it's read it? And it gets very, very confused. So naively in the past, I've gone in and went, well, you know what? I can just delete the checkpoint. And then that will get rid of the history of what files I've read. So next time I run my Autoloader job, going into that same directory, yeah, I'll have duplicates and I can manage that. I can be merging data, but it's going to ignore what it already knows about that given checkpoint, which is good. So if I go back over here, I can just run that exact same thing again. It's going to initialize my stream. It's going to look at the checkpoint. It's going to go, what's the name of the event grid trigger I'm currently using? Ah, there's no checkpoint. This must be the first time I've ever kind of read from that file. So objectively, great. I'm going to get all of my files through, but it's going to set up a whole separate event grid subscription. And that's, you know, it's not the end of the world. It's just looking at my data, but it does mean I'm going to have the old one. So my old ID of that C269 blah, blah, blah is no longer associated to any active streaming query. I've now got a brand new ID. So if I rerun this, that's now my current streaming query ID. I've got a new checkpoint folder. That in itself has a new metadata file that's got new data inside it. It's got a different ID. But then if I swing back to my landing spot, if I look in here, I can see, well, I've got my new topic, it's been set up, but I've got my old one, and it's just still sitting there. And then if I go back to look at my general blob store, I've got my queues. So that's the other side of the EventGrid store, of the autoloader story. So it's using EventGrid to watch the blob and fire events when something happens, and it's using a queue to store that data, to store that list of files. Now, I've got my old ones in here as well. Now, hopefully that should make a little bit more sense, because you can look at these and goes, oh, well, actually, I know what C269 blah, blah, blah is. That's just a streaming query ID. At least we've got consistency in terms of the streaming checkpoint, the query as it's labeled in Databricks, the autoloader EventGrid, the autoloader queue. They're all stamped with the same ID. We now have this nice lineage going across all of these objects. But every time I decide, oh, I need to refresh that table, and I do it by deleting the checkpoint and reloading, I'm spinning up new resources. Now, is that a problem? No, not at first. Not too big a thing. But the thing I actually hit with a client very, very recently is you've got quotas and limits around EventGrid. So you can have 100 different EventGrid topics. Now, over here, when I had all these different topics that were building up on my landing spot blob store, that was all under one custom topic. And I had, 5, 6, 7 different event subscriptions inside that topic. Now, if I've got 50 or so entities, if I've got 100 different folder structures that I'm looking at inside that blob, and I decide, oh no, we need to do a reload, and I trash them and I reload them, you can see how you can actually quite quickly creep near that 500 subscriptions per topic. So actually keeping track of orphaned ones and clearing them down and looking after them is actually something you need to be on top of when you're using Autoloader in production, because this stuff can get out of hand. So how do we do that? What options do we have available? I mean, obviously I can just go delete these things, but I'd have to be figuring out what's my valid query ID, what's my not. It's fairly hard to tie those things together. It's fairly hard to know which ones have actually got outstanding. And certainly, annoyingly, I mean, I can just delete queues en masse in here, but if you're looking at EventGrid, I'm trying to delete, if I've got 100 subscriptions in here that I need to delete, I can't, there's no checkbox. I have to go into it, hit delete, go back, and just be trying to keep track of all the ones, and it's painful. Basically, doing this stuff manually is fairly painful. Now, I do have the Python CLI. I could be just writing a little bit of code, have a little Python script, run it as a Python function. There are some ways I can manage this in my general Azure approach. But one of the things that we now have is the Cloud Resource Management library as part of the Autoloader stuff. So this is on the main Autoloader page, got loads of details in here. Under Cloud Resource Management, we've got a little bit of snippet of code telling us how to run things. Now, this is only available in Scala. So as long as you're happy writing a little bit of Scala, and I'll show you a quick notebook, and it's very, very similar to how we're running Autoloader anyway. But we can do this kind of stuff. So we can say, create a load of, or basically get my cloud files config set up the same as we did previously. And then we've got things like set up notification service. So I can create a new EventGrid subscription with a custom resource suffix. So if I want to say, well, actually, I'm getting close to my 500 and I'll create separate individual ones, I can use that for it. List notification service. Tell me which ones are out there. Tell me my list of stuff that I may not even be aware. I may not have looked at blob storage. Just give me the list of ones I currently have. And then tear down baseline ID. Super, super useful. So quick little example of what that looks like. So I've got a Scala notebook here. So I'm going to say, well, actually, import my Cloud Files Azure Resource Manager library. I'm doing the same thing as I had in my other notebook. I'm just bringing in a load of dbutil secrets, storing them as things. The only difference is I've got to put val in front of it because I'm writing Scala, not Python. That's it. Otherwise, it's exactly the same syntax. So I run that, and that creates my little set of variables. And then I'm saying I want a new manager. So it's kind of a manager class, which is in a Cloud Files Azure Resource Manager class. New manager, pass in all my options. Again, just feeding in those various different variables I've populated from my secrets, and then click create. So that creates a new manager object that's hooked up to the specific tenant, client, resource group, all that kind of stuff that I put in there. And then we can do this. We can say list notification services. Now this goes off and runs a query using those connection details against the particular blob that I'm trying to connect to, against a particular EventGrid subscription I'm trying to use, and then brings me back my list of active notification services. Essentially, what are all the event grids currently hanging around? What are all the topics, the subscriptions? What are all the queues that are associated to it? So that takes a moment, and that looks like it actually collects it up. It goes and does the query there and then, but then the data, it returns as a data frame. So I've now got a data frame I can go and query and say, what are my currently active things? Now, because I've been playing around, I've got a couple of prototype ones, which the checkpoints disappeared, but it's still got no event grid. It's very, very confused about that. But you can see the main ones that I'm looking at are my NYC taxi ones. I can see what are my different ones. I can see my old one. So that's C269. I've got the event grid subscription that's related to that. So it says, well, this is the stream ID. That's the name of the streaming checkpoint. I've got the name of the checkpoint location, got status, when it was last updated, got the event subscription that it's hanging under. I've got all the filters. So if I had that prefix on there, if I had a particular folder structure, I've got the name of the queue that's associated. So essentially it's going back from my essentially my folder in the leg, my delta table in the leg. It's able to know these are the different bits that this is hooked up to, which is great. Okay, so I can go from there and I can start running some queries. In which case, so our C269, we know that's orphaned. We don't want that anymore. I'm going to take that ID. I'm going to store that as quick stream ID variable. And I'm going to use this manager.teardown notification services and pass our stream ID into there. And that'll find that in that list. It'll find the associated event grid. It'll find the associated queue and it'll delete. Simple as that. There we go. Deleted, deleted. So if I go back over here, so if I go into my list of subscriptions, if I hit refresh, so I no longer have that C269 there. That's gone and cleared up the event grid subscription that was associated. If I go back to my queues, I'll no longer have that queue. So super, super easy, super useful. Just an out-of-the-box function saying, once you've created this manager, you can just pass it a stream ID and it'll go and delete the various different bits and pieces that are joined to it. Now, because that services, that's a data frame, we can be a little bit smarter. So we can do things like filter it. So take my data frame, filter it when it is one of the event grid subscription, one of the autoloader settings that is on my NYC folder. So ignore all the test ones, ignore the ones in a different folder, and just bring back the ones that are looking at that NYC taxi. In this case, I've not refreshed again. I need to go back, run this. It does seem to collect it. It's not alive. It's not the normal lazy executor. So it's going off. That's going to go back and list it. I'll rerun this filter when it's done, and then we'll only see the two currently active stream IDs in there. Which again, whatever logic that you want to put in there, you want to compare that to a list of ones that you're currently using. If you want to compare that, if you're trying to tear down just one entity, okay, get rid of this table, I want to restart, I'm going to start from scratch. You can run those kind of queries in here, which is kind of nice and useful. That runs, still going, there we go. Let's redo that filter, and we should see we've only got those two ticks left. Okay, so I've got two active stream IDs, only that one's active, we know that. But if I wanted to tear down all of that, we can do the Scala version of a for each loop. So for each thing in my row, bring that back, set my current row as my current stream ID, and tear it down. So we can build like a little, I've not called it DF, it's called services. But essentially, I want to take my list, bring it up, look through them all, clear them all down. Now that's gone through, it's deleted my two active ones, so those two are now gone. So if I go back, refresh, I've gotten rid of all the active event grid information that's linked to my NYC taxi. And that suddenly makes things so much more manageable, so much more easy to use, and so much more kind of just maintainable in the long run. So I'd say take a look at those. If you're using Autoloader, then absolutely getting a couple of maintenance notebooks that are using the Cloud Files as your resource manager library so you can set up new ones with a custom prefix. If it ever looks like you're going to have more than 500 data sources coming from one particular source, like one particular blob store, then using that setup notification service and giving them custom ones. So saying, well, these 50 are going onto that with that prefix, these 50 on that prefix, these 50 on that prefix. And that allows you to actually escape outside of that 500 entities per 500 subscriptions per topic limit. You can still only have 100, but it means, rather than hitting that limit prematurely on one particular thing, it allows you to double up and have lots and lots and lots on a single source. But otherwise, having something to just regularly go in and look at what the notification services are, and then tear down the ones that are no longer active. I mean, honestly, if you're looking just at the time, you've got a load of information in here. And I wrote something the other day that was just using the creation time. So if they're going on the same place, so if they're different stream IDs, but they've got the same path prefix filter. So they're saying, well, actually, I'm trying to query the same data, which is in here. So we've got the same blob service, default containers landing, NYC taxi. Oh, they're trying to query the same thing. You can just delete any that isn't the most recent. That's just a quick window function on top of my data frame. And then suddenly things become much more useful, much more usable. So definitely advise having a look at those. I'll drop the links for those two into the description down below. But otherwise, if you are having a go with Autoloader, if you're trying to use Autoloader in anger in production, you'll definitely need some of that stuff eventually. Now, whether or not you bothered with creating the custom prefix and having it all managed, and whether or not you're actually sort of keeping the metadata separately, so you always know the stream ID that's associated to your entities in whatever kind of metadata management system you have, I don't know. Certainly on your tables, on your Hive tables, when you create them, you can put extended properties. So maybe keeping the stream ID against them might be useful. Lots of different things we can do there. As always, thanks for joining me today. Plenty more videos on the way in this month and next month. And yeah, otherwise, let us know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.